the Mary scene was very controversial among Catholics, naturally. And
there's more than one scene. So which scene are we referring to specifically?
Well, I'm talking about the scene where she talks about Jesus' birth.
Yes.
At the campfire.
I just want to be clear for our listeners what scene we're talking about with Mary.
Yeah. Jesus is out healing people. There's this great long one shot that we talked about, different people talking around the campfire, and eventually Mary shows up and joins the group for basically the rest of the season. On the road, which who knows if that would have, actually happened. But they're all talking about the way that they feel and the sort of like the intimidation they feel and trying to like live up to being Jewish and the call to greatness and their discipleship to Jesus and everything else. And Rhema, Thomas's like pseudo girlfriend, says like, okay, so I'm just going to get into the transcript here. Rhema says, I feel like I need to not make any more mistakes. And Mary responds, how do you think I felt? Andrew says, you probably feel that every day. And she says, not anymore. He always reassured me. God always made me feel like I shouldn't be burdened. So that's like the first controversial point is like Mary saying, how do you think I felt? As though like Mary could be, if not sinning, then making mistakes. And like, okay, a mistake is not really necessarily a sin, but it still does raise this question about like Mary's perfect virtue and everything. Like I think that here we get into a little bit of gray area. I don't think it rises to the level of heresy and saying that Mary committed sin. Now, clearly this is reflecting a Protestant viewpoint about Mary and not a Catholic one. But in what's said in the scene here, I don't think that they're getting to the point of actually, like fully going Protestant on it.
Yeah, I feel like there's still like plausible deniability so that a Catholic viewer isn't going to be alienated by this necessarily. Yeah. But someone who's really astute, or I think someone who has a particular devotion to Mary will definitely bristle at this. Yes. Because look, it's this false modesty that I was mentioning earlier. Like, I forget where I read this, but, I think it's Aquinas who describes humility, as basically truthfulness about your position in the cosmos. And certainly like no one's more humble than Mary. But if it is truthfulness, then her humility would require her to acknowledge her sinlessness, right? So there wouldn't be a false modesty of like, I'm a sinner or anything like that, right? Yeah. And
I think we can say just from the outset, like this scene, it is not worthy of like the proper Catholic conception of Mary.
Yeah.
I don't think that we need to say that like they have a blasphemous intent. I think that what they're doing is trying to make Mary relatable, essentially. Right. And they're just missing some things. So it doesn't say that she sinned. A mistake is not a sin.
Right.
And she is trying to relate with Rhema. Right. And she then does say, she doesn't feel that anymore. So maybe it's like, you could talk about like all the fear of like a humble person at fearing to sin, fearing to offend God, something like that. You could try to spin it in that direction. God always made me feel like I shouldn't be burdened. That does like highlight that like it's a special grace to be able to take on this great role and not be like angsty about it, and not be falsely modest about it, anything like that. So I'm willing to give that somewhat of a pass.
Me too.
I think. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't really terribly troubled by that.
The next point is, okay, so Mary Magdalene says, so how did you feel when it happened? His birth, even before that. How did you know? When did you know who he was? Mary goes on to say, nothing about it was easy. I can tell you that. More than anything like specific that she says, I think that's like the line that like keeps you from having plausible deniability the most. Yeah. Because if you say nothing about it was easy, well, there are things that we are taught
that were a little
definitely
easier.
easy, right? Like if she was to say like, it wasn't, not everything about it was easy, or like, whatever, like, but like to say nothing about it was easy, that's clearly false. She goes on to say, it wasn't in my hometown. My mother wasn't there. We had no midwife. I don't know if I'm ready to give all the details, maybe some other time. I don't know that she would have needed a midwife, but anyway, when Joseph handed him to me, it was like nothing I expected. It was like everything I had heard about having a baby, but I thought this would be completely different. What do you mean? Asked Simon. Mother Mary continues, I had to clean him off. He was covered in, I will be polite. He needed to be cleaned. He was cold and he was crying, and he needed my help. A teenager from Nazareth. I don't want to move on from that point yet.
Yeah.
So again, a Catholic wouldn't write wouldn't write like this. We can just like acknowledge that from the get-go. Now, okay. I had to clean him off. He was covered in, I will be polite. I think that we can interpret that to mean some kind of like afterbirth, something like that. Now, so that the controversial point is this: A, the tradition that Mary's birth was of Jesus was painless, and B, Mary's threefold virginity. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but I believe that the painless birth is not like de fide, all Catholics must believe this, but it's a very, very strong tradition from the fathers. Whereas the threefold virginity is basically de fide, all Catholics must believe this, meaning that Mary was a virgin before, during, and after Jesus' birth. And during would mean, to put it delicately, what the church fathers compared to Jesus passing through the door, closed door after his resurrection, or light coming through glass. Those are kind of the analogies that are made to it, meaning that her bodily integrity was preserved intact from the normal effects of childbirth. So now, having a miraculous birth of that kind, I'm not an expert on childbirth in any way, but it seems as though that wouldn't exclude. Like,
who knows?
Because
we're on
they
holy
keep
ground.
They keep it vague.
Yeah.
I don't think that would exclude that he would need to be cleaned off in any way.
Right.
Again, a Catholic would never write this.
Right.
But like, I don't know. I'd want to give you the opportunity to comment on all that, Josh, as the theology student.
Well, yeah. First of all, what you're saying is absolutely correct. That is something that the Church has consistently taught, and that Catholics are bound to hold. So I know that Dallas was trying to be careful, because actually in his pilot episode of The Chosen, which is not part of season 1, it was something he made before to fundraise money, which is about the birth of Christ. He shows, and this is an entirely different cast, much lower budget. You see them wearing like modern bits of Middle Eastern clothing. It feels in some ways very different, in some ways similar to what he did later on. But it's what got people excited and helped to begin to raise money for season 1. But he got a lot of flack from his Catholic friends about it, because he has Our Lady in agony as she's preparing to give birth to our Lord. And so he took that very seriously. I think that's one of the reasons that he hired, I'm forgetting just now the name of the priest that he's working with, but he hired as a Catholic priest as a consultant for the show.
Yeah.
So I think there he was trying to be vague enough, while still wanting to suggest that it was not just an easy ride for Mary. I'm not sure how well he succeeded. I feel like we didn't need that line about her being polite and again, Mary could have had a painless birth. He could have passed through her like he passed through the closed doors, and there still could have been amniotic fluid, as you just said, James. So, entirely plausible. There's nothing absolutely heretical about it. It just doesn't sound great next to the consistent teaching on that subject. Right. So,
and I think it really is just this line,
wrong, no,
well, nothing about it was easy.
Well, there's that. Yeah, I guess that would suggest.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, then again, you could take that to mean, the flight from Herod, and the having to go on this census trip to Bethlehem, and the house being full, and all these things. So it could have referred to other things, not referring to, rather than her labor pains that she didn't have. But
okay, so do we give it a pass?
I'm not going to give that a full as
pass.
much of a pass, but like again, I'm not prepared to say like their intent was blasphemous or anything like that. But this is part of the reason why I wouldn't show this show to children as much as people may be tempted to, or use it in catechesis. Because there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be confusing or just impact their imagination in ways that you wouldn't want. So moving on to kind of like the third point of this. Okay, so he was cold, he was crying, and he needed my help, a teenager from Nazareth. And I think this is like where they land it, that like she's, above all, she was amazed that God needed her help. That God became so vulnerable and needed her assistance, and that this plays into the conclusion of the episode, which is so beautiful. So she goes, my help, a teenager from Nazareth. It actually made me think for just one moment, is this really the Son of God? And Joseph later told me he briefly thought the same thing, but we knew he was. Okay. Again, like, depending on, everybody has different, like, ways of explaining, like, how doubt works, right? And, like, what constitutes like a sinful doubt. And also like when you're talking about Mary, there's even like non-sinful doubts that we can probably say she wouldn't have had. So like when you say it made me think, like, is it a thought that passed through your head? Was this like a temptation from the devil that you didn't, like entertain? Like all those questions for just one moment, like, but we knew he was, so like, again, this is not something I would ever feel comfortable writing as a Catholic, but like, I do think that they steer clear of actual heresy there. Yeah. I think that it just falls short of like everything that we know as Catholics about Mary.
Right. How is it that you put it, that this is not a worthy?
It's not worthy of Mary as we know her.
Yes, that's right. And I can say that confidently, without it being blasphemous, without it being heretical, that this is not worthy of our Blessed Mother as we know her as Catholics.
Yeah. And, like, I think that it takes on greater weight in an imaginative portrayal, because if I was reading by an article by a Protestant that said that, like, I'd be like, well, I wouldn't really think twice about it. I'd be like, well, that's where he is. Like, he doesn't have the full understanding. When it's an imaginative portrayal like this, and it like puts those words into her mouth, it hits a little harder. Yeah. But we pray for, like mercy, and there's plenty of reasons for mercy. Like if anything they said, like in their intent or anything offended Our Lady, like, I don't know. I don't know their hearts. So like, I think that they're trying to be faithful to like their understanding of theology, while like not going too far to offend Catholics. Mm-hmm. And so,
so I think I think we've covered the Marian aspect of this sufficiently.
Well, there's one more thing I would like to touch on really quick.
Okay.
So he was crying and he needed me. I wondered how long that would last. He doesn't need me anymore. Not since we taught him how to walk and eat. He hasn't needed me for a long time, I suppose. He grew up, blah, blah, blah. I wish I could say that has made me happy. Of course, as a Jew, I'm excited to see everything he does for our people, and I'm proud of him. But as a mom, it does make me a little sad sometimes. This is an area where I just don't know, like, how much did Mary know about what her continuing mission would be? I think at this point with the wedding at Cana, I think that she would be pretty like confident in that, but not everything had been revealed. She hadn't been given like officially motherhood over the church yet. Yeah. And then the episode ends with her, like his continuing need for her being confirmed. Where you mentioned, James, he goes in, he's exhausted to his tent. She's the one who goes to him, and she's the one who shows the apostles what it's all about.
Yeah.
You know, what it means to be a disciple and a friend of Jesus. And we see this too in the moments before the Sermon on the Mount, this like reprise of their wedding at Cana moment, where there's this like foreshadowing of like his passion and the fact that like the more public he goes, the closer he gets to that moment. So, you know, I have to say, like in the details, in the writing, in the dialogue writing, I mean, like there are things that fall short, but I do have to say that I'm pretty happy with like the actual actions of Mary in this show, showing her function in a very beautiful way.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, she essentially functions as mother of the group at various points. I mean, you see that very clearly when the disciples are, they're all greatly distressed at Jesus' absence when he's gone to speak to Quintus. And, even though, it's not a scene where the conflict dissipates, you still see her basically functioning that way. And I thought that was, really beautiful and very plausible, even though, again, as the Gospel of John presents it to us, her sort of motherhood over the church is something that is, as you said, given